welcome to Spooks and Stitches, a knitting crochet podcast with a slightly spooky twist. My name is Sheena Perro. I'm your host. I'm an author and knitwear designer from the Pacific Northwest. And if you enjoy the podcast today, then please like, subscribe, comment, or share so that we can boost our viewership a little bit. So October is still a really busy month. Ankle is doing better. I'm able to pretty much walk on it normally. It just feels kind of tired and fatigued, and my foot is still pretty bruised. So I'm still healing from that. I also hope that you enjoyed last week's 36-hour knitting video. That was pretty fun to film. And then next week is going to be my yarn tour of northern Seattle. And then the week after that, there will be a podcast in between, but the next bonus video after that is going to be my yarn organization video. So I'll go through everything that I got on that tour, as well as the stuff that I got from Knitpicks, like in between everything. And then you'll just kind of see a little glimpse at my whole stash, and I'll talk about how I'm organizing it, as well as a few other things. If you've been following my Twitter and Instagram, then you know that I have been posting a lot of stuff over in the shop. And I can show you a couple of the items that I have added recently. I'm doing a whole bunch of destashing as a result of filming that video. It's already been filmed, it just hasn't been edited. So let me grab a few things and I will show you kind of a highlight reel. Okay, so most of what's going in the destash is tools. I've had people give me a ton of tools over the years as like relatives have passed away or they've gotten out of the craft after starting it. And unlike yarn, tools don't really get used up, so I'm destashing them. And one of the lots I have, I'm selling all of these in lots, so it doesn't really make sense for me to ship out a single crochet hook. So this is a set of 3. These are all vintage, and I think they might have all come from my grandma. I could be wrong about that because, like I said, I've gotten a lot of these from different places. So these are all larger hooks. This one's a 6mm. And then these are non-standard sizes. This one is an N. Which I don't remember the metric size on that. And then this one falls between an N and an O. So it's a halfway point. This one I think is Bakelite. This one is plastic, I'm pretty sure. And then this one's metal. So I've got some vintage stuff going up. If you are a collector of vintage tools, that might be something for you to look into. I also have like some filet crochet stuff if you're into lace making, as well as some other things that are going into the shop. I also have some destash yarn. So this is some Cascade Heritage sock yarn in a nice gray color. And then this is Koigu. And this one, it's fingering weight, but it's not sock yarn. It doesn't have nylon in it. So it's just this really pretty blues, purples, and greens. It's kind of like a dark oceany type thing, which normally would be right up my alley, but I kind of like brighter tones in that color palette. So this one is also in the destash. And then I don't know if these are going to be up by the time the podcast is up, but I'm also adding in some finished objects that need a little bit more love. So I'm going to be adding these 2 shawls. This one is, it's hard to tell on camera, but it's a 5-pointed star, and I will post a picture in here. This is, I don't remember the name of the rainbow yarn, but it is a rainbow sock yarn, so it's a 75-25. And then the black is Knitpicks Stroll. I love this shawl. It's kind of an awkward shape for me, and I'm not a big shawl person to begin with. I enjoy making them, I just don't really wear them. So I want that to go to a better home. It was so much fun to make, and I don't really want to give it up, but I do want it to get more love than I'm giving it, because it has literally been sitting in a box since I made it 2018, 2017. So I want this to go to a good home. I love the yarn. I don't know what to do with it. And then the other one that I'm selling is this one. And this is, the yarn type is Serenity Garden, but I can't remember the manufacturer. I think it's a subsidiary of Red Heart. So it's either a synthetic or it's mostly synthetic. It might have some cotton in there, or possibly bamboo, going by the texture. I'm not positive. I would have to look it up, but I'll put the details in the description. And it was so much fun to make. It's so squishy and soft. It doesn't go with any of my outerwear. And I don't wear a whole lot of pink or brown. So this one is also going to go to a new home, and you can find both of those in the shop if you so desire, along with all of my stitch markers, my books. There's a couple of patterns in there. If you're looking for more patterns, make sure you check out the Ravelry links down below. That's where most of my patterns are for sale. Unfortunately, due to computer crashes, I no longer have the original PDFs of most of those patterns, so I can't upload them to Gumroad. But I do have all of my links down below if you are interested. Now, on a less cheerful note, I do want to bring up something that was brought to my attention in the last couple of weeks. So I'm not sure where to start with this. So this was not like a comment directed at me. It was just a PSA someone posted on Instagram, and I'm glad that they did. So apparently back in, I believe, the 1930s, Spooks was a racial slur. I was not aware of this when I named the podcast. I was just looking for something alliterative. And as far as I know, that usage is no longer in favor. Like, every time I've heard it, it's been referring to ghosts, specters, spirits, creepy stuff, which is how I used it in naming the podcast. But I want this to be a safe and inclusive space. I'm not seeing it as harmful, but I'm also very white, as you can probably tell. So if you think that I should rename the podcast, I would rather do that sooner rather than later. I would like to keep the name just because it's a hassle to change it. And like I said, I don't think that usage is really being used anymore. So I don't think that most people are associating Spooks and Stitches with racism and knitting. So if you have an opinion, please be polite about it. Please respect each other in the comments, but just leave a comment. Let me know what you think. So like I said, I don't want to cause harm to anyone. I apologize if that has happened. I was completely ignorant on this subject. It didn't occur to me to check to see if it had been a racial slur at some point. So just let me know what you think, and I will address any comments that I get in the next episode. I'll also be discussing this over on the Patreon as well. Okay, so on to finished objects. I only have one this week, and it's very special because it's our first sewn object on the podcast. So if you've been following my channel for a little while, you probably have noticed that I do have a series of sewing videos that I was doing called All Dressed Up and Nowhere to Go. And it was specifically meant to be like a quarantine limited series. I'm hoping to continue it. It's just going to be a little less frequent. And originally it was meant specifically for sewing videos and costuming. However, I have learned over the course of the last year or so that I am not good at filming myself sewing. Just having to set up the filming equipment and the lighting and then still having room to move around and work, because I tend to move around a lot when I'm sewing, especially on the machine and in the early stages of the project when I'm cutting and pinning and ironing, and it's just really hard for me to film that. So I will still be posting some sewing stuff over there, but that's mostly going to be more events. For example, my yarn crawl and the 36-hour knitting challenge also went over there. So that's going to be like some of my special in between videos in between the podcast. But anyway, back on topic. I finally finished up a whip that I started ages ago, and I started off filming it for All Dressed Up. But I realized that one of the reasons I wasn't finishing it was because I didn't want to set up to film it. So I finished that this week. I just had to attach the waistband and do the closures. I needed to add a zipper. That was all it was waiting on. That's it. So I went ahead and did that, and I will post a few pictures right here so you can see it. It is a full circle skirt made from an IKEA bed sheet, and the trims and stash are the trims are all either from my stash or I ordered a couple of them on Etsy. I couldn't tell you where I got them from. They're just very basic. There's a black lace that looks crocheted but isn't, and then there's a velvet ribbon on the bottom just above that, and then around the waistband there's a satin ribbon. It's got a built-in underskirt or slip, just because I realized after I cut it out that you could see completely through the skirt when there was light. So it does have a underskirt for modesty, and I sewed 18th century style pockets into the waistband, so they look like regular pockets, like regular inseam pockets, but they're actually an 18th century style pocket bag, which means that they are much larger, and I think that they sit a lot more nicely than when I've tried to do inseam pockets in the past. So that turned out really well. I'm happy with it overall. My one disappointment is the waistband. I put in some heavyweight interfacing to help it keep its shape, but I'm not happy with the way it turned out. I intended this to be worn without a corset because it's the history bounding skirt. I'm going to wear normal undergarments with it, but that caused it to wrinkle, and with the interfacing, the wrinkles became really noticeable. So at some point I'm going to have to add boning to the waistband, but that's a future Sheena problem. That's not something that's going to happen right away. I do need to give it a wash and an iron because it's been in storage for so long, and even though it's been sitting in a bag for the last 6 months, it is still covered in bast fur, because I swear his fur is magic. You never see him shed. He just walks by and then suddenly you're covered in fluff. But anyway, life with cats. On to the whips. I haven't made any progress on the red velvet vest. That is on hold because I am trying to finish up 2 projects in the month of October. Today's the 21st, so I need to get a wiggle on. I've also been working on the flamingo blanket, just kind of here and there while I'm watching TV. It lives on the couch for the most part, but it doesn't look any different really because the rows are so long, or the rounds. So I'm still working on that, just in drips and drabs, like half an hour here, an hour there. It just hasn't gotten very far, but it'll get finished eventually. I did add the second ball of yarn to it, which was in my yarn haul a couple weeks ago from Knitpicks. So I am starting on the second ball. I'm currently on the 3rd round, and I'm just gonna go until I run out of yarn, basically. So it's gonna have 4 or 5 rounds on it. And then the other 2 things that I'm trying to finish up this month are these are the Monet socks. This is the 2nd sock, and this is my basic top-down vanilla sock with heel flap. And this is where I was last podcast, so I've made quite a bit of progress. And I'm going to change that progress keeper here now before I forget. Okay, so this is ready to go now. So that's where we are with that. I am on the foot. I just finished the gusset, and I am about an inch and a quarter into the foot. So I'm hoping to finish that up by the end of this weekend. My main priority is the Crumb, which this is something that I'm making for Ash. It's an Andi Satterlund pattern, and I'm using Knitpicks Comfy Worsted in the color Copper. And it's coming along okay. I kind of got slowed down by the sleeves. This is all tangled up. I'm sorry. I am not very well prepared, apparently. So I believe that in the last podcast, I was right around here, which this is the first decrease on the first sleeve. And then I just marked all of the, where I start and stop each set of decreases. So the first sleeve is done. And then I picked up for the second sleeve and finished the first set of decreases. So this is the one that I really want to get finished by the end of the month, because this has been on the needles for about 2 months, which for me, for a sweater, is like super fast. But Ash's been waiting on this for a while, and her birthday is the 28th, so I want to get this done so that she can wear it for her birthday if she wants to. It is going really well. I did alter the sleeves just a little bit. The way the pattern was written, I had adjusted the arm side so that it would have more of a gentle slope rather than just kind of ending suddenly. And that increased the size of the armhole. But then when I picked up the stitches, the way that I do it so that it fit kind of easily and naturally into the arm side, I picked up fewer stitches than it called for, but it was still plenty big enough. I had her try it on. So this is not a surprise. She totally knows I'm making it for her. So she tried it on. The fit was fine, even though the actual arm circumference was about 2 sizes down from what was in the pattern. So I'm basically just following those directions. And it's coming out fine. I just need to finish that second sleeve and then do like the collar and the button bands and stuff. So that should be done fairly soon. I've been doing a lot of editing lately for both my book and for a client. So I tend to read while I'm editing, or read while I'm editing. I tend to knit while I'm editing so that my hands stay busy. I don't know why, but particularly when I'm on the computer, but also when I'm reading books, especially since COVID started, I get antsy if I'm reading for more than about 15 minutes. I've been in a massive reading slump. So sitting there and having something to do with my hands helps me focus and not feel bored or like I need to get up and do something else. So that's what I've been working on while I edit. And I think that's all I have to say about yarn at the moment. So let's take a little sponsorship break, because it's my podcast and I'm sponsoring it. So this week I just wanted to take a second and talk about my Patreon. As you probably know, I lost my job at the end of August. I've not really found anything since then. I'm mostly doing freelance work and trying to promote my books and things like that. That's one of the reasons why I'm trying to promote the podcast, because if I can monetize it, any little revenue stream at this point is helpful. So Patreon, I will have a link down below, is basically where you can help me out with this. It is the only source of regular monthly income I have at this point, so it's super important right now. You can join for $1 a month, and at the $1 level you get behind the scenes access to whatever I'm working on in terms of books. I've already got at least 5 first draft manuscripts are uploaded to Patreon that you can just read for free if you're a member. So you can see, like, for example, Magic in the Headlines, my book that came out in the spring. You can go back and read what it was like before I started the editing process. So you can see all of the changes that were made between the early draft and the later draft. And it's kind of cool because you can see how some of my opinions have changed and how the book has developed and changed, because I started writing that, it was in 2012. So it's been a while. I mean, that's one of the older books that I've pulled out for publication. So you can see all of those changes. You can also get access to polls where you can vote on things like the spooky story that I tell at the end of the podcast. You can also pick things like character names. You can help me decide on titles and plot points. So that's really cool, and that's all at the $1 to $3 levels. I also have $10 and $20 patron levels, and if you join at that point, then you can get some physical rewards. I send out an annual goodie basket to members, so you'll get things like, there's usually a handmade item or two. You might get like a piece of jewelry or some stitch markers. You'll usually get a note from me and from the Clouder, so you usually have a kitty picture in there as well. And I can't even remember what I sent out in the last box. But there's all sorts of stuff. You get some of my swag, things like stickers, bookmarks, that kind of thing. And it's just, it really helps to support me and make sure that I and the cats have food on the table and a roof over our heads. So if you're so inclined, please do check out the Patreon down below. I also post regular updates there. So if you happen to miss out on the blog post, or you're not part of the mailing list, which you should also sign up for, there's a thing for that over on the website. You can sign up for those, stay up to date on everything, and it really is a big help to me. So check out those links down below. Oh, and a side note, just to streamline everything, right now my Patreon URL is patreon.com/Sophia Beaumont, which was my original pen name that I started using. Just to streamline everything, I'm going to be changing that to patreon.com/notmagic at the beginning of November. So I will post both links down below, just depending on when you're watching this. I will mark them, just know which one that you need to click on, because after a certain point, the Sophia Beaumont one will no longer be good. And I'm only doing that just because, like, my Twitter, my Instagram, my blog, those are all Not Magic. So, and Not Magic encompasses Sophia Beaumont, it encompasses my Sheen Apparel books, and it also encompasses my patterns, which I publish under my legal name, which is Sheena Pinnell. So those things are all under the Not Magic umbrella, and that's the only reason I'm doing this. So just check out those links down below. Just pay attention to what date and what link you're clicking on. So speaking of Patreon, our shout out this week is for Fiber Coven, which is a podcast available on whatever podcatcher you favor. And they actually come over from Patreon, and it is designer Emily and Dyer Lauren. And they work together and produce a podcast every couple of weeks where they talk about yarn and knitting and crafting. Sometimes there's like gaming stuff in there, and they also talk about something witchy at the same time. So give them a listen. They are very informative. They're really entertaining. I actually started listening to Emily when she was on Fuck This Knit, which is one of my favorite podcasts of all time, and unfortunately has ended. But you can also listen to that one on your favorite podcatcher too. I don't think it's been taken down. So they are really fun to listen to, especially if you're into like the spookier side of yarn. And I think at this point we are done with the yarn, done with the promotions, and it is time to turn down the lights and move into voiceover Sheena for our spooky story this week.
Turn down the lights and cuddle up with your knitting and a drink of choice, because it's time for this week's spooky tale. Poe turned out not to be so popular among my listeners, so I chose another story that's near and dear to my heart, and we return again to Washington Irving with the classic, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. This neighborhood, at the time of which I am speaking, was one of those highly favored places which abound with chronicle and great men. The British and American line had read near it during the war, and it had therefore been the scene of marauding and infested with refugees, cowboys, and all kinds of border chivalry. Just sufficient time had elapsed to enable the storyteller to dress up his tale with a little becoming fiction, and, in the indistinctness of his recollection, to make himself the hero of every exploit. There was the story of Dofu Martling, a large blue-bearded Dutchman, who had nearly taken a British frigate with an old iron 9-pounder from a mud breastwork, only that his gun burst at the 6th discharge. And there was an old gentleman who shall be nameless, being too rich a mynheer to be lightly mentioned, who, in the Battle of White Plains, being an excellent master of defense, parried a musket ball with a small sword, insomuch that he absolutely felt it whiz around the blade and glance off at the hilt, in proof of which he was ready at any time to show the sword, with the hilt a little bent. There were several more that had been equally great in the field, not one of whom but was persuaded that he had a considerable hand in bringing the war to a happy termination. But all these were nothing to the tales of ghosts and apparitions that succeeded. The neighborhood is rich in legendary treasures of the kind. Local tales and superstitions thrive best in these sheltered, long-settled retreats, but are trampled underfoot by the shifting throng that forms the population of most of our country places. Besides, there is no encouragement for ghosts in most of our villages, for they have scarcely had time to finish their first nap and turn themselves in their graves before their surviving friends have traveled away from the neighborhood, so that when they turn out at night to walk their rounds, they have no acquaintance left to call upon. This is perhaps the reason why we so seldom hear of ghosts except in our long-established Dutch communities. The immediate cause, however, of the prevalence of supernatural stories in these parts was doubtless owing to the vicinity of Sleepy Hollow. There was a contagion in the very air that blew from that haunted region. It breathed forth an atmosphere of dreams and fancies infecting all the land. Several of the Sleepy Hollow people were present at Van Tassel's, and, as usual, were doling out their wild and wonderful legends. Many dismal tales were told about funeral trains and mourning cries and wailings heard and seen about the great tree where the unfortunate Major Andre was taken and which stood in the neighborhood. Some mention was made also of the woman in white that haunted the dark glen at Raven Rock, and was often heard to shriek on winter nights before a storm, having perished there in the snow. The chief part of the stories, however, turned upon the favorite spectre of Sleepy Hollow, the Headless Horseman, who had been heard several times of late patrolling the country, and, it was said, tethered his horse nightly among the graves in the churchyard. The sequestered situation of this church seems always to have made it a favorite haunt of troubled spirits. It stands on a knoll surrounded by locust trees and lofty elms, from among which its decent whitewashed walls shine modestly forth, like Christian purity beaming through the shades of retirement. A gentle slope descends from it to a silver sheet of water, bordered by high trees, between which peeps may be caught at the blue hills of the Hudson. To look upon its grass-grown yard, where the sunbeams seem to sleep so quietly, one would think that there at least the dead might rest in peace. On one side of the church extends a wide woody dell, along which raves a large brook among broken rocks and trunks of fallen trees. over a deep black part of the stream, not far from the church, was formerly thrown a wooden bridge. The road that led to it and the bridge itself were thickly shaded by overhanging trees, which cast a gloom about it even in the daytime, but occasioned a fearful darkness at night. Such was one of the favorite haunts of the Headless Horseman, and the place where he was most frequently encountered. The tale was told of old Brower, the most heretical disbeliever in ghosts, how he met the horseman returning from his foray into Sleepy Hollow, and was obliged to get up behind him, how they galloped over bush and brake, over hill and swamp, until they reached the bridge, when the horseman suddenly turned into a skeleton, threw old Brower into the brook, and sprang away over the tree-tops with a clap of thunder. This was immediately matched by a thrice marvelous adventure of Brom Bones, who made light of the galloping Hessian as an errant jockey. He affirmed that on returning one night from the neighboring village of Sing Sing, he had been overtaken by his midnight trooper, and he had offered to race with him for a bowl of punch, and should have won, too, for Daredevil beat the goblin horse all hollow. But just as they came to the church bridge, the Hessian bolted, and vanished into a flash of fire. All these tales, told in that drowsy undertone with which men talk in the dark, and countenances of listeners only now and then receiving a casual gleam from the glare of a pipe, sank deep in the mind of Ichabod. He repaid them in kind with large extracts from his invaluable author, Cotton Mather, and added many marvelous events that had taken place in his native state of Connecticut, and fearful sights which he had seen on his nightly walks about Sleepy Hollow. The revel now gradually broke up. The old farmers gathered together their families and their wagons, and were heard for some time rattling along the hollow roads over the distant hills. Some of the damsels mounted on pillions behind their favorite swains, and their light-hearted laughter, mingling with the clatter of hoofs, echoed along the silent woodlands, sounding fainter and fainter until they gradually died away, and the late scene of noise and frolic was all silent and deserted. Ichabod only lingered behind, according to the custom of country lovers, to have a tete-a-tete with the heiress, fully convinced that he was now on the high road to success. What passed at this interview I will not pretend to say, for in fact I do not know. Something, however, I fear me must have gone wrong, for he certainly sallied forth, after no great interval, with an air quite desolate and chapfallen. Oh, these women, these women! Could that girl have been playing off any of her coquettish tricks? Was her encouragement of the poor pedagogue all a mere sham to secure her conquest of his rival? Heaven only knows, not I. Let it suffice to say, Ichabod stole forth with the air of one who had been sacking a hen roost, rather than a fair lady's heart. Without looking to the right or left to notice the scene of rural wealth on which he had so often gloated, he went straight to the stable, and with several hearty cuffs and kicks roused his steed most uncourteously from the comfortable quarters in which he was soundly sleeping, dreaming of mountains of corn and oats and whole valleys of timothy and clover. It was the very witching time of night when that Ichabod, heavy-hearted and crestfallen, pursued his travels homewards, along the sides of the lofty hills which rose above Tarrytown, and which he had traversed so cheerily in the afternoon. The hour was as dismal as himself. Far below him the Tappan Zee spread its dusky and indistinct waste of waters, with here and there the tallest mast of a sloop riding quietly at anchor under the land. In the dead hush of midnight he could even hear the barking of the watchdog from the opposite shore of the Hudson, but it was so vague and faint as only to give an idea of his distance from the faithful companion of man. Now and then, too, the long-drawn crowing of a cock, accidentally wakened, would sound far, far off, from some farmhouse away among the hills, but it was like a dreaming sound to his ear. No signs of life occurred near him, but occasionally the melancholy chirp of a cricket, or perhaps the guttural twang of a bullfrog from a neighboring marsh, as if sleeping uncomfortably and turning suddenly in his bed. All the stories of ghosts and goblins that he had heard in the afternoon now came crowding upon his recollection. The night drew darker and darker, the stars seemed to sink deeper in the sky, and driving clouds occasionally hid them from his sight. He had never felt so lonely and dismal. He was, moreover, approaching the very place where many of the scenes of the ghost stories had been laid. In the center of the road stood an enormous tulip tree, which towered like a giant above all the other trees in the neighborhood, and formed a kind of landmark. Its limbs were gnarled and fantastic, large enough to form trunks of ordinary trees, twisting down almost to the earth and rising again into the air. It was connected with the tragical story of the unfortunate Andre, who had been taken prisoner hard by, and was universally known by the name of Major Andre's tree. The common people regarded it with a mixture of respect and superstition, partly out of sympathy for the fate of its ill-starred namesake, and partly from the tales of the strange sights and doleful lamentations told concerning it. As Ichabod approached this fearful tree, he began to whistle. He thought his whistle was answered, but it was a blast sweeping sharply through the dry branches. As he approached a little nearer, he thought he saw something white hanging in the midst of the tree. He paused and ceased whistling, but, on looking more narrowly, perceived that it was a place where the tree had been scathed by lightning, and the white wood laid bare. Suddenly he heard a groan, his teeth chattered, and his knees smote against the saddle. It was but the rubbing of one huge bough upon the other, and they were swaying about in the breeze. He passed the tree in safety, but new perils lay before him. About 200 yards from the tree, a small brook crossed the road and ran into a marshy, thickly wooded glen, known by the name of Wiley's Swamp. A few rough logs, laid side by side, served for a bridge over this stream. On that side of the road where the brook entered the wood, a group of oaks and chestnuts, matted thick with wild grapevines, threw a cavernous gloom over it. To pass this bridge was the severest trial. It was in this identical spot that the unfortunate Andre was captured, and under the covert of these chestnut and vines were the sturdy yeomen concealed who surprised him. This has ever since been considered a haunted stream, and fearful are the feelings of the schoolboy who has to pass it alone after dark. As he approached the stream, his heart began to pump. He summoned up, however, all his resolution, gave his horse half a score of kicks in the ribs, and attempted to dash briskly across the bridge. But instead of starting forward, the perverse old animal made a lateral movement, and ran broadside against the fence. Ichabod, whose fears increased with the delay, jerked the reins on the other side, and kicking lustily with the contrary foot. It was all in vain. His steed started, it is true, but it was only to plunge to the opposite side of the road, to a thicket of brambles and alder bushes. The schoolmaster now bestowed both whip and heel upon the starving ribs of old Gunpowder, who dashed forward, snuffling and snorting, but came to a stand just by the bridge, with a suddenness that had nearly sent his rider sprawling over his head. Just at this moment, a splashy tramp on the side of the bridge caught the sensitive ear of Ichabod. In the dark shadow of the grove and the margin of the brook, he beheld something huge, misshapen and towering. It stirred not, but seemed gathered upon the gloom like some gigantic monster ready to spring upon the traveller. The hair of the affrighted pedagogue rose up upon his head with terror. What was to be done? To turn and fly was now too late, and besides, what chance was there of escaping ghost or goblin, if such it was, which could ride upon the wings of the wind? Summoning up, therefore, a show of courage, he demanded in stammering accents, "Who are you?" He received no reply. He repeated his demand in still more agitated voice. Still there was no answer. Once more he cudgelled the side of the inflexible Gunpowder, and, shutting his eyes, broke forth with involuntary fervour to a psalm tune. Just then the shadowy object of alarm put itself in motion, and with a scramble and bound stood once in the middle of the road. Though the night was dark and dismal, yet the form of the unknown might in some degree be ascertained. He appeared to be a horseman of large dimensions, and mounted on a black horse of powerful frame. He made no offer of molestation or sociability, but kept aloof on one side of the road, jogging along on the blind side of old Gunpowder, who had now got over his fright and waywardness. Ichabod, who had no relish for this strange midnight companion, and bethought himself of the adventure of Brom Bones with the galloping Hessian, now quickened his steed in the hopes of leaving him behind. The stranger, however, quickened his horse to an equal pace. Ichabod pulled up and fell into a walk, thinking to lag behind. The other did the same. His heart began to sink within him. He endeavoured to resume his psalm tune, but his parched tongue clove to the roof of his mouth. He could not utter a stave. There was something in the moody and dogged silence of this pernicious companion that was mysterious and appalling. It was soon fearfully accounted for. On mounting a rising ground, which brought the figure of his fellow traveller in relief against the sky, gigantic in height and muffled in a cloak, Ichabod was horror-struck on perceiving that he was headless. But his horror was still more increased in observing that the head, which should have rested on his shoulders, was carried before him on the pommel of his saddle. His terror rose to desperation. He rained a shower of kicks and blows upon Gunpowder, hoping by a sudden movement to give his companion the slip, but the spectre started full jump with him. Away then they dashed through the thick and thin, stones flying and sparks flashing at every bound. Ichabod's flimsy garments fluttered in the air, and he stretched his long, lank body over his horse's head in eagerness of his flight. They had now reached the road which turns off to Sleepy Hollow, but Gunpowder, who seemed possessed with a demon, instead of keeping up it, made an opposite turn and plunged headlong downhill to the left. The roads leading through the sandy hollow, shaded by trees, for about a quarter of a mile, where it crossed the bridge famous in goblin story, and just beyond the swells the green knoll on which stands the whitewashed church. As yet the panic of the steed had given his unskilful rider an apparent advantage in the chase, but just as he had gotten halfway through the hollow, the girths of the saddle gave way, and he felt it slipping under him. He seized it by the pommel and endeavored to hold it firm, but in vain, and had just time to save himself by clasping old Gunpowder round the neck when the saddle fell to the earth, and he heard it trampled underfoot by his pursuer. For a moment the terror of Hans von Ripper's wraith passed across his mind, for it was his Sunday saddle, but this was no time for petty fears. The goblin was hard on his haunches, and, unskilful rider that he was, he had much ado to maintain his seat, sometimes slipping on one side, sometimes on another, and sometimes jolted on the high ridge of his horse's backbone, with a violence that he verily feared would cleave him asunder. An opening in the trees now cheered him with the hopes that the church bridge was at hand. The wavering reflection of a silver star in the bosom of the brook told him he was not mistaken. He saw the walls of the church only dimly glaring under the trees beyond. He recollected the place where Brombones' ghostly competitor had disappeared. If I can but reach that bridge, thought Ichabod, I am safe. Just then he heard the black steed panting and blowing close behind him. He even fancied that he felt its hot breath. Another convulsive kick to the ribs, and old Gunpowder sprang upon the bridge. He thundered over the resounding planks. He gained the opposite side, and now Ichabod cast a look to see if his pursuer would vanish, according to the rule, in a flash of fire and brimstone. Just then he saw the goblin rising on his stirrups, and in the very act of hurling his head at him. Ichabod endeavored to dodge the horrible missile, but too late. It encountered his cranium with a tremendous crash. He was tumbled headlong into the dust, and Gunpowder, the black steed, and the goblin rider passed by like a whirlwind. The next morning the old horse was found without his saddle, and with the bridle under his feet, soberly cropping the grass at his master's gate. Ichabod did not make his appearance at breakfast. Dinner hour came, but no Ichabod. The boys assembled at the schoolhouse, and strolled idly about the banks of the brook, but no schoolmaster. Hans von Ripper now began to feel some uneasiness at the fate of poor Ichabod, and his saddle. An inquiry was set on foot, and after diligent investigation they came upon his traces. In one part of the road leading to the church was found the saddle trampled in the dirt. The tracks of horses' hooves, deeply dented in the road and evidently at furious speed, were traced to the bridge, beyond which, on the bank of the broad part of the brook, where the water ran deep and black, was found the hat of the unfortunate Ichabod, and close beside it a shattered pumpkin. Thank you so much for joining me this week. I'm not a huge fan of Ichabod as a person, but The Legend of Sleepy Hollow and its many adaptations have been a huge inspiration to me over the years, and even indirectly inspired Off the Rails. Back in my living history days, our Halloween event every year was themed around this story, and I thought it was appropriate, especially with the finish of the history bounding skirt this week. One of the funniest things I've ever seen was our horseman riding over the bridge, chucking his pumpkin head at the bonfire in the valley below, and striking our revered storyteller on the back of the head. Don't worry, he was fine, and continued to read for many more years, and getting hit a couple more times in the process. Turns out being headless means having really bad aim. While I'm normally fundamentally opposed to abridged tales, I did have to edit this story down for time. If you want to read the full story, I do encourage you to check your local library or Project Gutenberg, where I sourced my copy for this reading. That's all for tonight. Stay safe, kittens, and I hope you have something soft and fluffy to cuddle with until next time. Ciao.